Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to continue hearing evidence from Mr. Ron Dobson, formerly Commissioner of the London Fire Brigade. So I'm going to ask Mr. Dobson to come back in. Good morning again, Mr. Dobson.
Morning, sir.
I hope you're well. I hope you're ready to continue with your evidence.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Kinnear.
Thanks, sir. Good morning, Mr. Dobson.
Good morning.
When we broke yesterday, we were about to discuss the LFB commissioned review that was carried out by the BRE.
Yes.
And that report was dated the 9th of September 2015. Now, there are two particular comments in that somewhat lengthy report that I'd be grateful for your views on.
Okay.
Now, if we can go to that report, LFB 000-468-12/22. Now we see at the top of the screen the Coroner's Rule 43 recommendation, followed by various excerpts from Section 7 of the 2004 Act, both of which I suspect you're all too familiar with. And then under that italicised text, the next two paragraphs reads as follows. The fire authority's powers to inspect under this Act clearly interact with those under the FSO, the Fire Safety Order. Currently, fire officers carry out inspections of premises under the Fire and Rescue Services Act and under the FSO, usually at different times. Respondents have suggested that there are opportunities for fire officers who are carrying out inspections under the Fire and Rescue Services Act or under the FSO to exchange findings. It is not clear to what extent this is or can be done, since the different legislation is intended for different purposes. However, coordinated or joint inspections would lead to better information exchange and minimise business interruption for the building owner or employer. Now, did that report prompt you to think whether there was any merit in having joint inspections, so joint 72D and joint RRO inspections?
It did. It did, but I think my conclusion was that whilst it would be a very helpful thing to do, the practicalities about doing that would be very, very difficult, given that the number of buildings in London that need to be inspected by fire stations under 72D, and the different types of inspection, and therefore the different time it takes to carry out inspections under the Regulatory Fire Safety Order. So, whilst I was keen that there were joint inspections took place when they were particularly necessary on particular types of buildings, particular risks, or after fires and things like that, I didn't think it was a practical thing to be able to do on all inspections.
Thank you. Could we go to the second point I'd be grateful for your views on, and that can be found at page 31 in this document. Now, page 31, just so you can orientate yourself in the report, it was under the general heading Inspections,
Right.
Which starts on page 30. Now, the first two paragraphs at the top of this page 31 say this. In addition, BRE Global is informed that the available operational statistics data on inspections needs to be treated with some caution, since, based on the London experience, it does not appear to comprehensively reflect a risk-based approach. LFIPA consider that they do not have data that allows them to properly plan a risk-based approach. However, it is difficult to see how better data might be acquired. A review of the findings from the IRS, that's the UK National Fire Statistics, if people want to look at it, the definitions on page 20, and Operational Statistics, Appendix C, would appear to indicate that LFIPA are currently assigning too much attention to retail premises and licensed premises, which in IRS are not appearing as high risk. Now, stopping there for the moment, do you accept the finding that LFIPA and the LFB were unduly focused on retail and licensed premises at this time?
I would have accepted that criticism previously, but I'm not sure. I'd need to see the data, but I'm not sure that I fully recognise that as a criticism after Lakanal House.
Now, when you read that, did you take or did you feel that steps were necessary to recalibrate the focus onto more obviously high-risk premises?
Well, yeah, we did. We'd have a discussion about this, I believe, at the Corporate Management Board, in terms of the way we were assigning our inspection programme and the types of risks, and that obviously the buildings that were shown through the IRS that were high risk should obviously form part of our inspection programme. So we did discuss it, and we did ask for our inspection programme to be refocused as a result. They're certainly re-examined as a result of this.
When you saw the BRE's observation that there were inadequacies about the data, did that cause you to have concerns that the LFB had not got its act together following LACNOR in terms of acquiring high-quality data regarding high-risk premises in particular?
No, I didn't actually. I must say, I was very surprised to see this because I think, as Mrs Dexter said in her evidence, actually we had, in our opinion, I concur with Mrs Dexter, we had a very high-quality information management system within the London Fire Brigade. My perception, at least, comparing London Fire Brigade's data with that of the national database, was that London's database was in advance of the national one. So I was surprised to see this observation.
When you saw that observation, did you press the BRE on the foundations for that particular conclusion?
Not personally, no.
Do you know whether Mrs Dexter did or something?
Well, I don't know for definite, but I'm quite sure she would have done, because she concurred with me that our information process was actually better than the national one.
If we can look forward on this page to the third paragraph, and it opens with this sentence: with regards to the issue of how the Brigade prioritises its inspections of residential high-rise buildings, BRE has not had sight of any plan or schedule for London. Now, bearing in mind that your letter to the coroner, your response to the coroner, indicated that the LFB would create an inspection regime. Do you accept that that report demonstrates that as late as 2015, that still had not been done?
No, I believe it had been done. I can't account for the comment in the BRE report in this respect, but I'm sure this will be one of the things that Mrs Dexter would certainly have gone back to BRE on to question them on.
Do you remember whether you yourself pushed back on this particular conclusion and say, listen, BRE, you haven't considered XYZ evidence?
I didn't personally, no, but then Mrs Dexter held the relationship with BRE for this report. Now, the only 72D training package that the inquiry has seen can be found at BAB *00056, and this is the package that we think was released as part of Operational News 24 back in March 2013. Now, we heard evidence during Phase 1 that firefighters undertaking 72D visits could not recall receiving this training. As we established with Mr Brown, the training does not refer to the items listed in Appendix 1 of PN 633 that we looked at yesterday afternoon. Also, it does not provide practical guidance to crews on how best to carry out visits and identifying the things they need to identify. Now, at least in relation to high-rise buildings, do you accept that the LFB had not fully discharged its responsibilities under Section 72D, not least in the fact that crews were not properly trained on what they were required to do as part of 72D visits? Well, I think whether this, I was confident this package had been rolled out. I can't account for the views of the firefighters that were, the comments of the firefighters that seen during Phase 1 said they hadn't seen it. I don't know whether their training records indicate whether they saw it or not. I'm sure their training records will obviously tell a true record of that, so I don't know the answer to that. I think we made good efforts to fulfil our responsibilities under 72D, but I can certainly see there were some deficiencies in what we did and we could have done better.
The firefighters who attended Grenfell couldn't remember it.
Yeah.
That at least suggests that the training wasn't effective. Is that something which you'd accept?
Yes.
Could I now turn to a completely separate topic, and that's the topic of communications? Now, would it be fair to say that the LFB had, before LACNOR, experienced communications problems at larger incidents, and I'm thinking of the King's Cross fire in '87, Bethnal Green Road in 2004, and in response to the 7/7 bombings in 2005?
That's correct.
The inquest following the 2004 Bethnal Green fire identified communications issues as forming part of the relevant circumstances in which two firefighters died. Have I fairly and correctly summarised the conclusion?
Yes, you have.
I think at that stage you were acting but not yet formally appointed as Commissioner. Is that right?
No, I was the Assistant Commissioner for Service Delivery. The Bethnal Green Road fire, I believe, was in 2004. and I was the Assistant Commissioner for Service Delivery at that time.
When the inquest was held in June 2006, what position did you hold by that stage?
2006, I would have still been the Assistant Commissioner for Service Delivery, but I would have been the third officer as well, for operational purposes.
Now, is it right that the communication issues that were encountered at Bethnal Green Road related both to the failure to communicate relevant information across teams and officers, and also to the committal of 2 firefighters without radio communications?
As I recall, yes.
Do you recall the fact that the coroner expressed surprise that it was standard practice for a team of 2 BA wearers to be committed with only one set of BA communications between them?
I do.
And surprise is the correct word to use in those circumstances, is it right?
The coroner expressed surprise, yes.
And as a result of his Rule 43 report, the coroner endorsed a recommendation that had already been made by the LFB's SIA process, namely that, and I quote, LFB review and revise allocation of breathing apparatus, radio interface equipment, BARI, and radios on pumping appliances, so that every BA crew has radio communication. Do you remember that particular recommendation?
I do.
Now, we have a limited number of documents relating to the LFB's action plan arising from the Bethnal Green fire. And if we go to LFB 00122969, and if we could turn to page 60 in this bundle, and if it could be rotated. Could we look at key objectives 6.1 and 6.2, which are identified in the far left-hand side column? Now, in summary, those objectives required a review of allocation of BARI sets and to ensure that the procurement of the next generation of radios took into account the various issues identified by the coroner arising at Bethnal Green Road. Is that right?
It is.
Now, we don't have the documents that show what came of all of this, but we heard at phase 1 that BA teams were committed into the tower with 1 BARI set per team, and that when teams became mixed, this sometimes resulted in neither member of the team having a BARI set. Now, that evidence would suggest that the LFB took the decision, following Bethnal Green Road, not to extend provision of BARI sets, notwithstanding the coroner's recommendation. What's your response to that?
My recollection is that we did 2 things as a result of the recommendations from Bethnal Green Road. One was to ensure the allocation of a fireground radio to every firefighter as a personal issue or an individual issue for all incidents. So every firefighter had a radio available to them. And that, my recollection at least, is that we did we brought in guidance, or guidance, it was more than guidance, it was an instruction that all teams committed to BA incidents would have BARI.
Now, moving away from LFB's specific instance, to the best of your knowledge, what was the state of awareness at the LFB about radio communications issues that had been identified as a result of the World Trade Center bombing in 1993 and the attacks in 2001?
Well, we were certainly aware of the communications issues that arose at the attacks at the World Trade Center in 2001, and we were certainly aware of the communication problems that occurred at the bombings in 7/7 because we were part of that, came out in our own debriefs, and we're also part of the Greater London Authority scrutiny committee that sat about the 7/7 bombings.
Could we go to a particular document, which is CWJ 0000092? As the logo in the top left indicates, this is a document produced by what was then CLG, and it's a 2008 report called Incident Ground Communications. In broad terms, that report identified various communications-related issues for fire and rescue services. Is that right?
I think so, yes.
And they were issues that arose following the 9/11 attack. Is that right?
They were included in that, yeah.
Now, at Lacknell, is it right that the BA entry control officer was unable to make contact with BA teams via BARI sets, seemingly due to signal problems? Is that a fair summary?
On occasion, yes.
And that more generally the crews were overwhelmed with the volume of radio traffic, which in turn impacted adversely on the ability to communicate effectively by radio?
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Now, in your evidence to the Lacknell inquests, you attributed these problems to the lack of radio discipline, as well as the decision not to utilise the spillover incident command channel, which I think is channel 2, is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
Now, that being the case, why were radio communications not identified as an internal action point by the Lacknell House Board?
I don't know, to be honest. I can't account for that. I mean, I think the communications issues, as you've quite rightly identified, Mr. Kinnear, at all large incidents, there are issues with radio communications in terms of signal and traffic, etc. So I think whilst we believed that, we knew there were problems at Lacknell House, I don't think we believed they were extraordinary in terms of what we usually experience. And the other thing was that in the investigation into the communications issues, which was carried out as part of the Lacknell House review, where all of the radio sets that were used were inspected for defective things. There was actually, bottom line was, there's only one radio set that was found to actually be defective on the day. So I don't think we necessarily believed that the radio communications issues were something that needed to be a formal or a very defined action point.
I hope I put this fairly, but was the belief that communications problems occur at every or most big incidents indicative of a degree of complacency about addressing those problems that were experienced at big incidents such as Lacknell?
I don't think I would use the word complacency. I think we were well aware of the radio communications issues. We had looked at these communications issues over a long period of time, but the advice that we'd received from technical experts, the Brigade's technical experts at that time, were there wasn't any way to overcome some of the problems in terms of the types of buildings and the types of locations that we use the radios, given the use of fire and rescue services in high-rise buildings with concrete and steel structures. So we were aware of it. I don't think we was complacent about it, but I think we thought that there wasn't a technical solution which we could apply at that point.
Now, radio communications were the subject of recommendations by the coroner at Lacknell.
Yeah.
Probably the most useful way to start to look at what was recommended in the LFB's actions thereafter is to look at the pro forma that we looked at yesterday.
Okay.
And that can be found at LFB 000-34062. And if we could start at the very foot of page 8. Thank you. And you see at the very bottom of page 8, you see that it deals with the recommendation. And if we turn over the page to page 9, we see it is recommended that Brigade consider whether it would be beneficial to use additional BA radio communications channels and personal radio channels at major incidents. Now, if we look at the row below, we see a bold and heading policy documents, and in broad terms, first, that sets out the LFB's policy documents relating to radios, communications and messages. Is that right?
It does.
Secondly, it summarises, under the second heading, the LFB's training on the subject of radios and communications. And that text says this: use of radios included within Phase 1 and Phase 2 of firefighter development, FFD. There is no current requirement for refresher training. All personnel receive training in the use of the digital main scheme radio prior to it going into operational service. No continuation or refresher training is provided. And then finally, there's a summary of the systems which are deployed by the LFB, which I think for our present purposes consisted at that time of the UHF instant ground radios, airwave digital or main scheme radio. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, the next two rows in this table, and we're going towards the foot of page 9 now, and over the page into page 10, set out, first of all, considerations and options which were explored, and secondly, the proposal for the LFB's own response to the Rule 43 recommendation. Now, at this stage, can I just draw out 4 particular bullet points, which we find in the bottom half of page 10 over leaf, and you'll see those in the latter half of that page. What they say is this: raise all operational personnel's awareness of the identification of communications issues at incidents and the methods of overcoming them. These include the use of UHF Channel 2 repeater and leaky feeder equipment, the completion of training materials and the requirement to carry out training by all operational personnel on the use of radio equipment will reinforce and raise awareness of potential radio issues at incidents and improve radio discipline. Exercise the use of fire survival guidance, FSG procedure, including the use of a dedicated UHF command channel for the passing of FSG information. Consider the possibility of using additional legacy police interagency analogue radio frequencies. These are no longer utilised by the police and are already programmed into all of the Brigade's analogue handheld radios. Explore the use of digital airwave radios to provide additional command channels should communications difficulties be encountered at a specific incident. Now, we know from your response to the coroner, which can be found at LFB 000-42089, that the majority of these proposals were not taken forward. Now, your response to the communication-specific recommendation, if we could go to your response to the coroner on page 8. Thank you. Now, if we start with the second paragraph onwards, we looked at this in detail with Mr. Reason, and so I'm going to just summarise matters for you rather than going over it again. Ultimately, the LFB considered that the coroner's recommendation, but decided that 3 principal concerns outweighed the possible benefits of an additional radio channel. Those 3 concerns were these. First, that additional BA radio channels could cause firefighters to miss risk-critical information or cause a delay in the transmission of such information. Secondly, there could be a lack of coordination between teams. Thirdly, the capacity added by an additional channel may be negated by the need to retransmit information across the additional channel or trying to coordinate teams. Have I summarised matters fairly and accurately?
I think you have. Could I just add one more thing to that?
Please do.
I think that's all entirely correct what Mr. Reason said. I think the only thing that I would add to that is you need to remember the circumstances in which we're asking firefighters to carry out these actions with the radios. So actually we're asking breathing apparatus teams in very hazardous environments where it's very hot, very humid, there's smoke and fire, the visibility is sometimes nil, and we're asking them to carry out, and they will be concerned for their own safety as well as carrying out their task. And we need to avoid trying to ask them to make technical alterations to radios or technical alterations to things. And we also need to make sure that the communications that they're receiving as well as transmitting are as clear and as short as possible. So we just need to be very clear that actually the circumstances in which we're asking people to use these radios are not as we're sort of experiencing sitting here. It's a very different environment.
That's a very useful piece of context. Thank you, Mr. Dobson. Can we look at the foot of this page under the heading Proposed Action? You told the coroner this: the Brigade will engage with its training contractor to ensure that issues relating to instant communications are embedded within the current operational training. As to timescale, that's dealt with under the next heading at the very end of this page. This work has already commenced and is estimated to be completed by December 2013. Now we'll look at training in detail next, but your response taken as a whole gives the impression that you, as the head of the LFB, felt that the communications issues experienced at Lacknall were primarily a matter of user error or indiscipline and could be rectified by refresher training to prompt firefighters to use LFB's radio communications equipment properly. Again, have I put matters fairly and accurately?
No. I didn't.
Where have I fallen into error?
I didn't believe it was firefighter error. I believed it was firefighter pressure on firefighters in terms of the circumstances in which they were operating at Lacknall House. They were under immense pressure. The circumstances were deteriorating most of the time. And while communications is extremely important incidents, they would be fearing for their own safety as well as everybody else at the same time. So it certainly wasn't error, but the reason we thought the training might be effective was to embed the procedures and the actions required to communicate effectively more in firefighters. Not actually, so it wasn't actually error, it was just failure of the procedure, broke down under the pressure that they were experiencing.
Could we go to your third witness statement on this point? LFB 00110652/3. And if we look at paragraph 9, you said this. The issue of the difficulties reported in relation to instant ground communications was the subject of investigation instigated by the Lacknell House investigation team involving the Brigade's Health and Safety Department and experts from the Brigade's instant communications team. The aim of the investigation was to look as a whole at what may have caused the communication issues as reported on the instant ground, as there were a number of factors to consider that may have contributed to the difficulties reported. These included the material used in the construction of the building, the radio equipment itself, the distance of the BA teams from the bridgehead, or the amount of instant ground radio traffic taking place. And if we could go to paragraph 11 at the foot of the page, there you explained that a team led by DAC Cutbill investigated the communications difficulties and that a report was prepared addressing the impact of steel-framed buildings on interference with radio signals, which ultimately fed into the LFB's Lacknell Operational Review report. That's a long run-up to a straightforward question, which is why did these issues not form part of either the LFB's pre-actions or the response to the Rule 43 recommendations?
For the same reasons as I said earlier, which was that these were issues that we had experienced at other incidents. We didn't think that there was an action that we could include in the action plan as a result of Lacknell House, which would resolve these difficulties because they had things that we experienced at other incidents as well. We felt that reinforcing the training would be sufficient to actually correct some of the, or to embed the procedures more in our firefighters. But as far as the technical issues was concerned, we were, in that paragraph 11, we mentioned Mr. Tuckley there, who was our Brigade radio expert at the time. And his advice was that actually there wasn't the equipment that we could have, apart from leaky feeders and things, that would have improved the situation. And therefore, we didn't feel it necessary to include an action in the action plan.
You mentioned Mr. Tuckley. Can we go to some email correspondence passing from Mr. Tuckley? If we go to LFB 00110657. We find here an email from Peter Zamanjic, have I pronounced it?
Yeah, that's correct, yes.
Some hesitation there, to Roger Tuckley on the 13th of April 2010, which shows that report being commissioned. And if we look at the second paragraph on this page, Mr. Zamanjic stated this: as part of the inquiry into the Lacknell House fatal fire, a number of statements made by firefighters suggest their radios failed. However, having tracked all these statements back, I've identified that in reality, only one Barry set failed, a point you made earlier on, and was subsequently repaired. Would you be able to provide me with a report/explanation of why steel-framed buildings interfere with radio signals? Now, in response, Mr. Tuckley has sent an undated report, which we can find at LFB 00110659. As you see from the top of the page, it's entitled In-Building Radio User Difficulties. Can we look at the second paragraph on that page, which is below the two bullet points? And the text says this: when propagating into buildings, radio signals pass through various materials before reaching a receiver's antenna. The interaction of radio signals with building materials usually results in lower signal strength. Different construction materials have different attenuation characteristics. Some construction materials very rapidly attenuate signal strength. Buildings which have a significant thickness of concrete or amount of metal used in its production will attenuate the signal. Concrete floors are often poured onto a metal pan, which completely blocks most radio signals. Some solid foam insulation and some fiberglass insulation used in exterior walls have foil backing, which will reduce signals. Energy-efficient windows and metal window screens are also very effective at blocking radio signals. To be specific, RF energy entering a building will be partially absorbed and partially reflected by the building materials encountered. Now, given that buildings with materials such as concrete, metal, foam insulation, etc., might all impact or indeed entirely block radio signals, that was likely to be an issue, indeed a significant issue, at a great many buildings attended by the LFB to fight a fire. Is that a fair observation?
It had been, it was, and I believe it still is.
And is that a particular problem in relation to high-rise residential buildings?
Yes, it is.
And so communications issues and interference was likely to be a significant issue at a number of operational incidents.
Yes.
Were you aware that similar problems had presented themselves at Shirley Towers in, I think, April 2010?
I was, yes.
Could we go to the report prepared by Hampshire FRS into Shirley Towers on the 6th of April 2010? Now, the report is dated the 8th of April 2013 and can be found at LFB 00107-130. And if we could turn to page 53 and paragraph 3.10. This can be found under the heading Handheld Radios, and the text says this: the handheld radios used by Hampshire Fire and Rescue Service may not always operate effectively in high-rise buildings. These radios are also used by BA wearers to communicate with the BA Entry Control Officer. At this incident, communications proved difficult, necessitating the need to use other forms of communications, notably mobile telephones. The problem of poor radio communication in structures, such as high-rise buildings or ships, is well known. Post-incident testing of radios by HC showed that they were operating effectively. Now, this report is April 2013. That was a week after the LACNL Rule 43 recommendations were published and sent to UNCLG. Did you see this report or hear about it after it was published?
I heard about it after it was published, and I saw it later.
How much later?
I can't recall, I'm afraid.
Was it? Are we talking months? Are we talking years?
No, we're talking months, I would say weeks or months.
Now, could we go back to the Rule 43 pro forma that we were looking at earlier? LFB 000-340-62/9. If we could look at the highlighted yellow sections, and particularly look at the first paragraph, which effectively summarises the LFB's decision not to adopt an additional BA channel. Would you accept that your response made sense in the context of smaller incidents, but less so in larger incidents, where that one channel might simply become overwhelmed?
Not really, because I think certainly it would. Well, I think there was no question that smaller incidents, a second BA radio channel would not have been of help. In fact, it would have been an obstacle. So we was really only considering the recommendation for use of an additional BA radio channel in the context of large incidents, because that is really where we had the problem. So my conclusion from that is that we considered it in the right context in terms of the size of the incident, large incidents. But actually, at larger incidents where there's a lot of BA traffic, the risks of introducing a second BA radio channel, as described by Mr. Reesid and I've added to, would be magnified at large incidents because there was a lot more radio traffic taking place. So it's a really difficult issue in terms of whether or not an additional radio channel is helpful or not. And the decision we took was that it wouldn't be. If you were supposed to put it into context, when you start an incidents usually start small and get big. If you were to start an incident expecting it to get big and therefore introduce 2 BA radio channels immediately, then there's a way that would help you. It could potentially help you in managing the communications of the incident. Once you've started out an incident, which is smaller or smallish, that then develops, it's then very difficult to introduce a second BA channel because you then get all the problems identified by Mr. Reed in terms of making users switch from one radio channel to the other, messages can get lost, etc. So I still think that in the context of what we'll be looking at in the coroner's recommendation, the decision to not adopt a second BRA channel was the right one.
Now, Mr. Reason wasn't entirely clear on the point, but did the LFB actively and sincerely consider the possibility of adopting additional channels for handheld UHF instant ground radios?
I believe we did.
You say, I believe we did. Can you be...
Well, I didn't do it personally, but there was certainly, it was one of the things that we were, obviously the coroner recommended it, and therefore we considered it. But I think the conclusion that came to me, was put to me, was that we already had the opportunity for use of additional BA channels, and sometimes we would use channel 2 for incident command, etc. So we believe that the procedures we had, given the operational experience of the people that was carrying out the review, was that our system was probably the most appropriate.
And you're certain that was actively considered and a recommendation made to you not to proceed?
Well, I can't actually remember it happening, but I'm very confident it did.
Now, I hope I'm summarising this correctly, but Channel 1 was the primary instant command channel, and Channel 2, which required the use of repeaters, I think,
Yes.
was available to instant commanders as a spillover channel.
Yes.
Have I summarised matters correctly?
As I recall, yes.
Does it follow that the concerns raised with the coroner, the issue of different personnel receiving different information on different channels, and the possibility of needing to repeat information, was already occurring when people were using channels 1 and 2 anyway?
Well, I think the response to the coroner was in some way informed by that, yes. However, when you introduce channel 2 for command, the people using the channel are in a very different situation to the BA wearers. So BA wearers are in the midst of an incident with all the dangers that I've explained a few minutes ago. The people that are using the command channels are officers not usually in hazardous situations. They're working as head of sectors, or they might be on command units, or they might be on other command units doing functions. So it's about functions rather than really stressful situations. So and you've actually got people on the command unit who are managing the radio traffic on their behalf. So it's a much more straightforward and much more controlled process to introduce channel 2 for command than it is to split BA channels for BA wearers that are already in an incident.
Does that control still exist where there's a transition between the default BA channel 6 and its backup channel 5?
I believe so. I can't confirm completely.
You can't?
No, I can't, no.
We also heard evidence during earlier in this module that channel 3 was a task-specific channel to be used by the water sector, for example, or as it was used on the 14th of June 2017 for FSG calls, and that channel 10 was a command unit-specific channel. Is that right?
I think so, yes.
Mindful of that, surely firefighters using those radio channels were facing, again, the same risks as those conveyed to the coroner as a reason for rejecting her Rule 43 recommendation, i.e. different messages, different channels, and a potential confusion.
Well, they are, but nonetheless, I go back to my point that we're talking about people that are not working in the highly stressful situation of actually fighting a fire or carrying out a rescue. And actually people working in those functional sectors, as I was calling them, as you described it, so water sector or whatever, they are under much less stress, and therefore they're able to control and think about their communications and the method of communication much more than the BA crews working in incidents are.
Now, Steve McGurk, who you know is retained by the inquiry as an expert, told us that the transition between channels was not a risky practice, provided the transition is well managed. Do you agree with that?
No.
Why do you disagree?
My experience has been that actually the transition to changing channels at major incidents such as Lacanau or Grenfell is a very dangerous time for the whole of the incident command, because messages can be lost. Not everyone changes at the same time. It's not possible to achieve a complete transfer at exactly the same moment. So I'm afraid I must disagree with Mr McGurk there. And my experience has been when I've witnessed this try to be done, or tried to do it personally at incidents, it's a very difficult thing to do.
Gary Reason explained that an incident commander's management of a transition was the primary control mechanism, as he did, for a transition between channels 5 and 6. What would be your response to that evidence?
Well, I would say that it's the incident commander's decision whether to do this or not. It's not something that officers on the incident ground, whether they're in the command unit or elsewhere, would do without the incident commander's approval. But once the incident commander has approved that, it is then down to usually the command unit crew, the crew working in the command unit, to actually make that transition happen in terms of notification to people that need to know it's happening, confirmation of people have changed onto the correct channel, making sure that the whole process is still working effectively in terms of being integrated into incident command.
Now, separate to the question of UHF handheld radios, we've heard evidence both in Phase 1 and Module 5 about the communications difficulties and weaker signal strength associated with the LFB's 1-watt intrinsically safe Barry radios. Now, we heard Professor Johnson's evidence that Policy 458 on the use of handheld instant ground radio specified that the LFB's HX480 and the HX481 radios were not intrinsically safe, and that they, and I'm quoting, should only be used where Barry sets are unavailable, close quotes. Do you accept that that was an unnecessary restriction on the strength of radios deployed by the LFB, keeping this 1-watt rule?
I think we need to think about the reason why it was there. And the reason for having these radios which are lower strength, which are, to use the term, intrinsically safe, is because we can't always be sure of the nature of the atmosphere in which we're committing firefighters to carry out their role and therefore would be transmitting messages. So the idea of having intrinsically safe radios at lower wattage is to reduce the possibility of a spark or some sort of ignition source being made when firefighters are transmitting at incidents. Now, there is a discussion, and that one that my personal view is that intrinsic safety was something that we followed slavishly in the fire and rescue service, not just London Fire. I know it's changed in some places recently, but that was something that was followed relatively slavishly by the fire and rescue service for the reasons I've just explained. But I think it is a reasonable thing to say, and I think it might have been Mr. McGurk that said this, that in incidents such as where there's a large fire, it's unlikely that firefighters are going to go into an explosive atmosphere because the fire's already ignited the atmosphere, and therefore the other point though is that we have one set of radios issued to firefighters, and they wear those at every incident they go to, and we can't always be sure what incident they're going to go to next time they use the radio. So things like when we attend terrorist incidents that could have explosive atmospheres, gas leaks, chemical incidents at major chemical works or what else, explosive atmospheres can be caused by lots of different things. So on balance, the decision we took within LFB was to maintain the allocation of intrinsic safe radios for breathing apparatus sets for those reasons I've just explained. There is still a debate about that, whether or not that's the right decision. I think at the time, with the information available to us and with the national guidance from government departments, Home Office as well at that point, I think it was the right decision, but I'm not sure it's the right decision completely going forward.
Do you think the LFB's experience of poor radio signal coverage at major incidents was in part caused by the use of 1-watt radios?
I'm sure it was in terms of transmission from Barry sets, yes.
Could we go to LFB 000-31268? This is DCLG's operational guidance on breathing apparatus. It was published in January 2014. Could we go to page 83? We see here a section of the guidance concerned with BA ancillary equipment and additional procedures. And under the heading Key Elements, the first sentence reads thus: the level of intrinsic electrical safety of the ancillary equipment provided should be appropriate to that of the hazard to be encountered and cognizant of the existing standards applicable to the BA set and integral equipment. Would you accept that, contrary to the apparent weight of that advice, the LFB in fact took a one-size-fits-all approach to radios?
I would, but if I could just explain that. I think the issue here is I can't disagree with the comment that's made here that the the level of safety should be appropriate to the hazard to be encountered. But that would potentially imply that we'd need to keep a range of radios on fire engines and deploy different types of radios depending on what incident we're going to. And I think that would be completely impractical because time would not allow for that. Firefighters, when they respond to incidents, are trying to respond as quickly as possible, and therefore we use a radio set which is generic to the risks that we think they would encounter.
One of the points that Professor Johnson made, apropos what you've just said, was that to encourage fire and rescue services to adopt what he called an evidence-based approach that determined the intrinsic safety requirements of the various environments in which a fire and rescue service would find itself.
Yes.
What are the advantages and disadvantages of that course in your view?
Well, the advantage would be that obviously we could use higher strength radios in certain circumstances, which would probably or hopefully lead to greater signal strength, which would mean to greater consistency of the radio communication. The practical problem with that is that we don't know what we're going to attend when we respond to calls as firefighters. So once again, I say we would need to keep a stock of more than one type of radio and deploy the type of radio that's appropriate to the incident. The problem once again with that would be that we don't always know what the risk is when we attend an incident. So, for example, even at a fire, there could be parts of a building that are on fire where there is flammable gases that haven't yet been ignited, so we wouldn't want to send firefighters into that situation with a non-intrinsically safe radio. Similarly, as we know, when we attend gas leaks or chemical leaks or terrorist incidents, we don't know the environment which we're going to go into, and therefore we need to default to the highest level of safety for our firefighters in terms of intrinsic safety until we know the risk we're actually exposing them to.
Now, the LFB has now moved to higher strength barrier radios, and it's maintained a stock of 1 watt radios for high risk environments. Why couldn't that step have been made during your tenure?
Well, it could have been, but we did consider whether we needed to maintain intrinsic safety for our radios, and as I said earlier, the decision we came upon was to maintain our current situation in terms of intrinsic safety for the reasons I've just explained in terms of operational difficulties, but also because I can't quote what it was now, but there was certainly guidance from the Home Office and others in terms of radio strengths and wattages that were available to fire and rescue services.
If you are going to maintain the 1 watt approach, if I can call it that, then the LFB has to fully assess and mitigate the consequences that flow, aren't they, for limited radio strength?
Yes, and I believe we did that because there were procedures in place where, firstly, there was procedures for BA crews introduced after, I think it was after the Bethnal Green fire, where if radio signal is lost, then that crew should consider exiting the incident so they can maintain communications. And the other thing that we introduced subsequently was the BA telemetry boards, which improved communications for BA teams with the entry control.
Could we turn over the page and under the heading additional considerations? This may be the text which you had in mind, which you referred to earlier on, I don't know, but the first paragraph says this: the provision and use of non-intrinsically safe electrical equipment may be considered appropriate for all normal operational requirements, where such provision confers a significant benefit to the safety and effectiveness of BA teams. Such equipment may include, for example, handheld radios and thermal image cameras. Mm-hmm. Now, looking at that, the guidance from CLG appears to be envisaging that BA crews should be permitted to use non-standard equipment if it improves their safety and effectiveness. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree with that.
Would you also agree that by sticking slavishly to the 1 watt limitation for BA crews, the LFB's policies and procedures hampered safety and notably the effectiveness of its crews?
Not entirely, no. I mean, this guidance, I think you said, Mr. Kinnear, was dated 2014?
January 2014.
Yeah. Well, the guidance that preceded this, in my recollection, is the guidance that preceded this had different advice to this. So I think the advice that came with the previous guidance, certainly in terms of the guidance we'd had previously through the fire service manuals of firefighting, was different to this and advised a more cautious approach than this document was providing. So I'm pleased that London Fire Brigade have changed their approach now in response to this, but this came out in 2014, and it takes time to change all these things.
But bear in mind what you say, why
Yeah.
didn't this January 14 guidance prompt a review by you to look at the use of non-standard equipment for the reasons it sets out there?
Well, I think we would have done that. I think, as I alluded to yesterday, when this guidance came out in 2014, I'm not trying to excuse inaction, but we were going through a very difficult period of 49 strikes by the Fire Brigades Union, the additional pressure that was placed on the whole organisation. And this was one of the things that wasn't prioritised right at that moment, but would have been carried out later on.
Just so I can clarify that answer, you said it would have been done, and then you later on went to say you didn't want to excuse inaction. We've got no evidence and have seen no evidence that a review was carried out following publication of this January 2014 publication. So which is it? Did it happen or didn't it happen?
It didn't happen then, no.
So when you say it would have happened, that's
Yes,
not right?
subsequently. No, it was subsequently.
Well, subsequently after the Grenfell fire.
No, subsequently after the industrial action had finished and we had more time to actually do things that had come out during that period.
Can we go back to the Rule 43 pro forma on communications, which we find at LFB 000-340-62/9? And if we could look at the final paragraph on that page. As its opening words indicate, it considers to some extent transmission strength, and the solution that's identified is over leaf on page 10, which says this. Radio coverage can be enhanced. It's in the first 3 lines on page 10. Radio coverage can be enhanced by the use of analogue radio repeater equipment, which can be further improved by attachment of a leaky feeder cable. Additional repeaters can be deployed to increase the area covered. This equipment is carried on command units and by the duty radio officer. Now, Gary Reason explained to us that the use of repeaters and leaky feeders was the LFB's primary means of overcoming the communication difficulties flowing from the use of 1 watt radios. Is it right that repeaters and leaky feeders were not deployed at Lacknell?
Yes.
Could we go back to the transcript of your evidence to the inquest at Lacknell? CWJ quadruple 0 00 10 /70. If we could look at line 22 onwards. You were asked there, what are your views on how best to overcome radio communications problems, which, as I understand it, can have 2 causes. One is communication blind spots in a high-rise building or a steel frame building, and, over the page, the other is sheer volume of information. Now, in response, at line 2, going through to line 16, you said the following. Taking these 2 aspects really, it's not firefighters in London are not uncommon with communications difficulty related to the building environment in which we work. So radio signals from the report that we've commissioned, or many reports, particularly one that we commissioned following Lacknell House. Now, just stopping there, did you have in mind there Mr. Tuckley's report?
I did.
Once again identified and confirmed, the signals work best when they're in clear line of sight of each other's radios. In high-rise buildings which are constructed from steel construction and steel and concrete, there are many factors which will do something which we call shield the signal from getting to the radio, or the one that it's intended to get to, and these things are not uncommon to firefighters. If we can then move ahead a few pages to page 73 and line 5, you said this. So in terms of addressing this problem for the future, and it is at many instant debriefs that we've attended over the years, instant ground communication is very often raised in terms of an issue, and that does relate to the shielding of the problem of the buildings and sometimes the traffic. If the shielding of the building is a problem, then there are other facilities available to instant commanders to seek to overcome that. Now, Mr. Reason's evidence was that communications did not feature as part of the IMPD, DOT or ODCB processes in all the time that he was sitting on ODCB, and that he was not aware of issues with the Barry sets. Now, based on your evidence of the Lacknell inquests, that comms problems were commonplace and often featured at debriefs. Do you accept that the absence of discussion, at least at ODC-B level, demonstrates a failure both at IMPD, DOT, and the ODC-B processes?
I can't account for why there was no entries on the IMP process for communication, because it was a common problem. So yes.
And so there's a consequential problem in the sense that not only is the nature of the problem not cascaded down to operational crews, the workarounds are equally not communicated to operational crews. Would you accept that?
Well, no, because the operational crews are the ones that would be raising, not for the IMP database, but the operational crews are well aware of the issues relating to high-rise buildings and radio communications, and they came out in many performance reviews of command. That would not have been an uncommon thing to come up.
Flowing from the commonplace nature of the problems, is it fair to say that the use of radio repeaters and leaky feeders themselves would add to congestion at instance?
Yeah, it does, yes.
Can we go back to the passage that's actually in front of us, where you say this? As I recall, it starts at line 14 onwards. I think Mr. Holland referred yesterday to leaky feeders, which is basically a cable or an aerial that we run out off the drum like an extension lead through a building or through an area, and that will pick up the signal and transmit it back to the base station. They are predominantly in place for long tunnels and for things like use on London Underground, where the communication issues between radios is even. The communication difficulties between radios is much greater than it usually is above ground, and it would not be the instant commander's first choice to use leaky feeders in a scenario such as Lacknell, because they would, firstly, they would divert attention from other priority tasks to lay the cable out, but more importantly, they would it would represent a further hazard in the stairwell where they have to lay the cable up, so it would not be the instant commander's preference, but it would be a piece of equipment that would be available to them. Now, in addition to your own observation to the coroner, Professor Johnson explained that leaky feeders are typically only effective within line of sight of the cable. Was that particular limitation something about which the LFB was aware before the 14th of June 2017?
Yes.
Given your evidence that leaky feeders would not be an instant commander's preference or first choice, why were they used as the primary fallback mechanism?
Because they were the most practical one that we had. I can't think of any other method of fallback that we had available to us. So they were the best that was recommended to us by our technical experts at the time.
Wasn't there a case, given the weight of evidence regarding communications problems and the repetitive nature of the problems that you were encountering, wasn't there a case for going back to the drawing board and identifying technology which improved both strength and performance of radio signals at instance, rather than on makeshift supplementary kit that had its own limitations and presented its own risks?
I absolutely agree, but the information or the advice we've been provided by the technical experts at the time was that such equipment didn't exist, and therefore that would have been not a fruitful process.
When CLG before CLG published its guidance in January 2014 that we were looking at a few moments ago, do you remember, was there any move in the fire sector generally in the country to review the quality of radio communications and how they could be enhanced to ensure greater signal strength and more effective communications, particularly at larger incidents?
I do recall a discussion about this at one of the CFAR committees that I attended, and it was passed to one of the CFAR technical committee to actually deal with. I'm not aware of anything that came out after that. I think probably for the same reasons as we were experiencing in London Fire Brigade. At that time, we were being advised that there was no other technical solution which would improve the situation for us.
Can we say this, though, that following Lacknell and review of the communication-specific issues, there was not a full, comprehensive root and branch review of what technology was needed that could be used both safely and effectively in fighting fires?
Yes.
And for the reasons you've given?
Yes.
Can we look at another email chain, for which apologies, Mr. Dobson? LFB 000 86741/2. Here we see an email sent to you and other senior officers by Gary Reason on the 14th of May 2013, entitled Feedback from Rule 43 Meetings. The opening line of the email says, "As promised, please find below a brief summary of the issues that were discussed and in some cases agreed during the 2 LACNOR meetings held earlier today." If we go further down, there's a heading, Outcome from Second Meeting. The email then lists the coroner's 5 recommendations. And if we look in relation to recommendation 5, if we can scroll down. Thank you. Incident communications. The text says this: "It was agreed that we should state, with supporting evidence, why we do not agree with the first part of the coroner's recommendation to consider additional BA radio channels. I will work with Jim Knighton, and Dave, presumably Dave Brown,
I think so,
to draft this evidence, which will use the benefits v versus risks argument to support our position. However, it was accepted that it would be advisable to offset this by committing to undertake additional awareness raising on instant communications through some form of training across the various staff groups." Now, the decision to release training packages was not, I think I'm right in saying, but please disagree, the considered outcome of a comprehensive risk-benefit analysis. On the contrary, it appears to have been a means of placating the coroner about the LFB's decision not to pursue the first element of her recommendation. Would you accept that?
I would agree with the first part of that statement. I'm not sure that we ever made comments just to placate the coroner, in your terms, Mr. Kinnear. And that was not the way we approached the coroner's recommendations. We were keen to actually take them on board and actually look at them very carefully and implement whatever improvements we could. And this was certainly one of the improvements that we thought was appropriate. One, in relation to the information arising from the debriefs of the LACNOR House, and also what the coroner said.
Now, the LFB had no policy or training provision to help crews deal with or to establish, restore lost communications. Can you help us as to why there was no such policy or training on that apparently common phenomenon?
Well, I'll refer back to the training you referred to earlier in one of the documents you showed me, which was during Phase 1 and Phase 2 firefighter development training about radio procedures and the use of the radio, the fireground radio, as well as main scheme and airweave radios. I would hope, or maybe I'm wrong, but I would expect training around that particular element to be in one of those Phase 1 or Phase 2 training interventions.
Now, if we can just deal briefly with communications training, we dealt with it with Mr. Groves, but I'd be grateful for your views for obvious reasons.
Yep.
Your response to the coroner indicated that the communications-related training would be done by December 2013. Mr. Groves accepted that both the station-based and senior officer package did not meet or address the communications issues that were experienced at LACNOR. And Mr. Reason's evidence on seeing the relevant slides of the packages was that they did not reflect what the package was intended to cover, including the role of construction materials and the potential need to restore lost communications. Now, although TCAP 0039 was signed off as complete in May 2015, it was never released due to the same IT issues that we've discussed with you yesterday and with other witnesses previously. Were you aware of the dire state of the implementation of the recommendations regarding communications training?
I was aware that there were problems with the rollout of some training packages as a result of the incompatibility of the Brigade's IT system. Whether or not I was aware of this particular one, I can't quite recall, but I certainly was aware of the issue.
And what steps did you take to remedy the situation?
Well, firstly, when I spoke to officers, asked is there another way the training could be delivered without need to resort to the IT system. The response to that was it would undermine the effectiveness of the training programme. And the other side to that was I spoke with the people responsible, or the officers responsible for the IT system in general, about one, were there improvements, fixes we could put in place to actually facilitate the rollout of training packages, which to some extent we tried but were limited success. And following that, subsequently and later on, obviously we managed to get elected members to approve the replacement of the IT system.
There was notwithstanding all of that, there was a basic and obvious solution that the two relevant TCAPs, 0039 on radio equipment and 0212 on highly insulated buildings, those programmes could have been released without the videos, thereby overcoming the video-related issues. That could have been easily done, couldn't it?
It could have been done, yes, but
it wasn't.
It wasn't, because I was advised by, the decision was taken, I was advised by officers that it would significantly undermine the effectiveness of the training package.
Now, the criticism that might be made of you is that in relation to communications during your tenure as Commissioner, the LFB failed to improve its equipment, policies or training in response to its experiences at Lacknell. What would be your response to that criticism?
I wouldn't accept that criticism for the reasons I've explained in my evidence over the last half an hour or so.
Could we turn to the nature of the LFB's response to the Lacknell recommendations and the fire itself? Now, for all three of the recommendations that we've explored in detail, incident command training, 72D and communications, the LFB's response was, broadly put, that its existing systems were adequate, but that it would go away and review matters. Is that a fair summary?
What were the three matters? Could you repeat the three matters for me, please?
Incident command training, 72D and communications.
Yes, I would.
Mindful of that, was there a feeling, whether held by you, your senior officers, or more broadly across the organisation, that in substance the Rule 43 recommendations were superfluous and that in effect the LFB had learnt and applied the lessons from Lacknell?
Absolutely not.
Can we go back to your evidence to the inquests? CWJ quadruple 0010/116. And if we go to line 15, you were asked this question. All right, now with that in mind, bearing in mind the future and prevention of fires of this kind and the risk to life in the future, do you feel, as an authority, that full efforts have been made to learn the lessons and to address them in the form of the policies that we've heard about today? And your answer was this: I do, and we're always keen to learn new lessons and improve our performance. But I do believe London Fire Brigade has taken on board the lessons from the fire, notwithstanding what may come out from the coroner following the inquest. But I do believe London Fire Brigade has taken full account and learnt as many lessons as we possibly can. If that was your view in March 2013, were you disappointed to see the extent of the recommendations that the coroner thought fit to direct towards the LFB?
No, I wasn't actually. I thought the coroner I think firstly the coroner from the letter commended the London Fire Brigade for the actions we'd taken since the fire and the things we'd already changed. And I think that that work we'd completed and the coroner's comment reflected that there would have been other recommendations to the coroner had we not completed that work prior to the inquest. But I felt the coroner made some very relevant and important recommendations, and we took them very seriously.
I suppose flowing on from that point, despite identifying 34 action points, the pre-action points that the LFB had internally identified, the coroner remained sufficiently concerned by the evidence that she'd heard to make the recommendations she had. Did that give you cause for concern about the adequacy and the thoroughness of the LFB's own internal consideration of the lessons after Lacknell?
Well, I certainly was disappointed that the coroner had found additional things, because obviously I thought we'd done quite a good job in terms of doing a thorough review of our performance at the Lacknell incident and other things relating to the guidance around building regulations, etc., and communication with the government. So of course I was disappointed the coroner had found things that we hadn't. But that said, that was the point of the coroner's inquest to do that. So an external scrutiny was always welcome, as far as I was concerned. So the fact that the coroner did identify additional findings, that was to be welcomed in my view.
Would you accept that there was a failure on the part of the LFB following Lacknell to take effective action and to really grapple with the problems that have been identified as a result of that fire? First of all, the risks of rapid external fire spread.
In general, I was pleased with the approach the London Fire Brigade took and the outcomes of the work of the Lacknell Board and the Lacknell Members Working Group. Subsequently, I was disappointed, and I still am disappointed, with the extent to which some of those actions that we took were implemented, and you've highlighted quite a few of those to me over the last few days, Mr. Kinnear, in terms of where the actions weren't followed through appropriately, perhaps. And I've tried to give you the explanation of reasons as why those were. But yes, I was disappointed that we hadn't completed it all perfectly, because that would have been my intention, because we've taken it very seriously. As far as external fire spread is concerned, I think we did our best to highlight to the relevant people about the risks of fire spread, external fire spread. We haven't touched on at all during my evidence the work we did with local councils and others to actually communicate the risks of fire in high-rise buildings to residents, which I was very proud of that as well. But I think we did our best to communicate the risk of external fire spread as it related to Lacknell House. And I think I said before that the difference between the Lacknell House fire and the Grenfell Tower fire was that we had panels below windows that were not of the right fire resistance, that failed early and allowed normal, naturally occurring and frequently occurring fire spread effects to take place from one window to another going upwards. The Grenfell Tower fire was very different to that, in that the building was effectively wrapped in flammable material, which wasn't the case at Lacknell House. So I do believe we did all that was appropriate following the circumstance at the Lacknell House fire.
Can I ask you just some brief questions on some discrete issues before we break for the morning? Really, it's going back to that cultural divide between fire safety on one part and ops on the other. In terms of addressing that divide, did you set up a formal initiative at any stage, or consider setting one up, which identified the extent of the divide and appropriate remedial measures?
We did discuss it a lot in the early stages of when I was Commissioner, and subsequently we took the steps that I explained to you on day one of my evidence to actually try to address that. We didn't set up a formal project or a formal intervention to identify the problem to more staff and to deal with it. I wish we had.
Yesterday we touched upon the complexities of evacuation. Would you accept now, with the benefit of hindsight, that instead of the informal discussions, the debate that you referred to yesterday afternoon, it would have been better, and indeed needed to be done, for the LFB to study the question, including by calling evidence from stations, etc., to methodically establish what the best approaches to evacuation of a high-rise residential building might be?
I wish we'd taken a number of actions in relation to the evacuation of high-rise buildings. As I explained to you yesterday, whilst it was a risk and we knew evacuation did take place and it was being dealt with, it was difficult to identify what the steps would be that you would tell firefighters to take to actually manage a full evacuation in a residential high-rise building where there was no central fire alarm, no record of who was in the building or not. Yes, I wish we'd consulted wider on that. I wish we'd involved evidence from fire stations on that. We didn't, and I regret that we didn't.
And also, there was a need to ensure that operational firefighters, indeed officers of all rank, were better aware of the limitations of stay put and had considered the prospect of evacuation of a high-rise residential building should the need arise.
Yes.
Could I turn briefly to section 72D again? We can go to it if you want, but you remember Appendix 1?
No, I remember it.
Clearly. You express very clearly your assessment of the limitations of the 20 or so bullet points that were set out, and how some, particularly the 10th and 12th bullet points, may well be beyond the technical knowledge of the crews attending on those visits. Could those crews not have been required to identify that the building had a cladding system, first of all? That was within their expertise and knowledge, wasn't it?
To an extent. If you look at walking around London any day of the week and you look at buildings, some of the cladding systems that exist on these buildings are not entirely evident to me, but I'm sure they do exist. There are some buildings where the cladding has been added as a subsequent rain screen or insulation method on these buildings, and probably it would be within the competence of most firefighters to identify that. But I'm not sure it's a fair statement to make generically that all firefighters will be able to identify cladding existing on high-rise buildings.
Crews would have been able to ask the responsible person to specify details of a cladding system if they suspected or thought or speculating as to whether one was in place, couldn't they?
They could, but it wouldn't be normal practice for operational crews to require or to ask for the presence of the responsible person at all 7.2D visits. Just as I've said earlier in my evidence about the difficulties of identifying the responsible person, let alone getting them to actually come along and talk to fire safety officers. So it's not reasonable, in my opinion, to expect fire crews to actually expect the responsible person to be there, present on every 7.2D visit, and that would slow the process down very significantly.
Mr. Dobson, over the past 3 years, we've covered a lot of evidence, we've gone through a lot of matters, and you've made concessions that you've set out. With the benefit of hindsight and knowing what you now know, what, if anything, would you have done differently?
Well, that's a question that I've asked myself many, many times since June 2017. It concerns me greatly that I could have taken other actions that would have in some way mitigated. I don't think I could have prevented the disaster at Grenfell Tower because we didn't know about the cladding, and I think the difficulties around the building regulations have also been very clearly identified by Dame Judith Hackett in her review of building regulations, etc. in this country. But I think there are some things that perhaps I do wish I'd done differently. I think you've very eloquently highlighted to me the failings around the cultural issues between the gap between fire safety and operations in London Fire Brigade. I knew about that gap. It's something I've experienced all of my career. I did try to change it. I was unsuccessful, certainly to the extent that I would like to have done, and I wish I'd taken more action to deal with that. It's quite a controversial thing to say in some ways. With some people it will be, but where I've seen the evidence in relation to the problems in the control room around training records, etc. At one point, prior to 2012, the Fire Authority took a decision to outsource the control, both the system and the training of the staff. That was subsequently changed due to a change in political nature of the authority in 2012, or at least the control of the authority. I wish I'd fought harder to actually maintain the decision to outsource the control and the control training. The reason for that is that had the training been outsourced in the same way as it was for operational firefighters, I think the issues with the training records and training that hadn't taken place would have been highlighted much more clearly and much more earlier than it was through the managers that sat in the control room. I think there would have been an external body notifying us and letting us know when training wasn't taking place. So I wish I'd pushed harder in relation to actually outsource that, because I think it would resolve that problem. And I think the other thing is I regret not pushing the government department harder in relation to all the issues we raised in the letters to Sir Ken Knight and to the Minister during the time around the dangers that we perceived through lack of clarity in terms of the building regulations around things like Regulation B4 and also around things like the testing of materials that were in place on buildings. I think Dame Judith Hackett highlighted quite appropriately that the building control regime in terms of the way materials were approved to be on buildings using desktop reviews and those sorts of things was inappropriate. And I think I wish London Fire Brigade had pushed the government harder on that to actually to deal with those problems. The final thing I think I would like to, and I've given this lots of thought, I think I wished I'd done differently was I wished we'd learnt more from international fires and we'd raised the issues of fire spread externally more clearly with firefighters. I do wish we'd done that. I don't think that would have prevented the fire at Grenfell Tower taking place. I don't think it, in many respects, would have probably changed the outcome too much, but I think it would be a relevant thing to actually to make firefighters aware of.
Mr. Dobson, thank you. Sir, I've come to the end of my prepared questions.
Yes, thank you.
It chimes conveniently with the usual morning.
It does, yes.
And so, might I ask for a quarter of an hour?
Yes. Well, of course. Mr. Dobson, you probably know that when Council gets to the end of his questions, we have a break so that he can just review the position, and indeed we can receive suggestions from other people about further questions that perhaps ought to be asked. So we'll have a break now. Is quarter of an hour going to be long enough?
Yes.
So obviously that takes precedent, would there be an opportunity for me to make a couple of comments after that? I really think I would really not like to leave the inquiry without making a couple of comments I think might help.
Yes, well, I'm sure you can do that.
Thank you.
Perhaps we'll see if there are any further questions first, and then we'll do it then.
Thank you.
So we'll break now. We'll come back at 25 to 12, please.
Thank you.
And as before, please don't discuss your evidence with anyone while you're
Thank
away
you.
from the room. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Clear. 25 to 12. If you find you need more time, just ask the usher to let us know.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, would you ask Mr. Dobson to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, Mr. Dobson, well, we'll see if there are any more questions. Mr. Kinnear?
Mr. Dobson, I have no further questions for you. The only thing that is for me to say now is to thank you very much for attending to give evidence over the past 3 days. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Dobson, you indicated earlier that you'd like to say something brief about
If I may,
the
sir,
matter. Yes.
it is very brief. I know the inquiry's got a very long agenda in front of it and a difficult task. First of all, I'd just like to thank the inquiry very much for listening to my evidence over the last few days. I'd like to say it's been a privilege to come along and help with the deliberations of the inquiry. There are some very serious and important matters that need to be identified as a result of the Grenfell Tower, and I have full confidence in the panel of getting to the bottom of those, and I hope I've been able to help in some way. Next thing I'd like to say is not on behalf of myself, it's on behalf of the officers and firefighters of the London Fire Brigade, actually. And that is that I can say absolutely, truly and clearly, everyone in the London Fire Brigade was 100% committed to learning the results, the lessons to be learned from the Lakenhall House fire. And I'd like to think that the things we put in place in terms of to establish the facts, a demonstration of that. I'm disappointed, as my officers would have been as well, that we didn't actually complete all those tasks in the way that we set out to. And I make this statement particularly not for me, but for the officers that work for me, and to say that my second statement lays out a range of circumstances that London Fire Brigade was operated in during that period. In particular, that period during, I think it was September 2013 and February 2015, where my officers were under significant pressure because of the period of industrial action. I think it was a testament to my officers that they came through that. London came through that without any significant loss of life. And I think, but I don't think we should in any way underestimate the debilitating effect that had on my officers and the brigaders overall, because it was a very difficult period for us. The final thing I'd like to say, if I may, which is just very briefly, we've spoken a lot about the training contract, or I know the inquiry's heard a lot of evidence about the training contract, and that's entirely appropriate. The decision to outsource the training contract was, in my view, taken after a thorough investigation by the Fire Authority, and that is contained within the future options for training reports that I think the inquiry's already had access to, but the reasons for doing that are very clearly laid out in there, the benefits and what we're trying to achieve. And just one comment that I regret having to raise this, but I think I do. That one comment was made by Miss Danny Cotton last week when she said that before the training contract you could have whatever training you liked. And that comment is so far from being accurate that I just felt I need to make the comment that it's just not accurate, because even before the training contract there were checks and balances in place. The budget was not limitless, and the truth was you could probably ask for what training ever you wanted, but you'd wait a very long time for it to be delivered, and there were long lists of training that people had asked for that were never delivered because there was no real controls over it. And with all its faults and things that I know there are faults with the training contract and the way it's administered, but actually there is a business regimen and a process about it that enables things to be properly prioritised if the system is working properly. But just wanted to make that comment. I apologise for making that, but I feel I just needed to. Right. Thank you very much.
Yes, well, thank you very much. Well, Mr. Dobson, all three of us on the panel have found it really useful and helpful to hear your evidence. I think it's particularly valuable for us to hear from someone who's at the pinnacle of the organisation and who has such a clear-sighted view of what went right and what perhaps didn't go quite as well as it might have done.
Yes.
And you've been very candid in giving us your account, and we are extremely grateful.
Thank you.
And I'd like you to go away in the knowledge that we have found it very useful to hear from you.
Great. Thank you, sir.
So thank you very much again, and now you are free to go.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Kinnear.
So that concludes, excuse me, the evidence for this morning. Mr. Millett will be examining the present London Fire Commissioner starting at 2 o'clock this afternoon.
Right. Thank you very much. Well, in that case, we'll stop at that point. We'll resume at 2 o'clock with our next witness.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. 2 o'clock, please.